So I thought, Susan, you've had such a fascinating life and journey through life. I thought we might start right at the very beginning. Is that okay?
Of course. Okay.
All right. Let's start with the early years then. So I know you grew up as the daughter of an English dancer and an Austrian electrician of Jewish extraction. And you also lived in Chiswick, but it was not the posh suburb of London that it is now.
Right.
So I was curious to see what these lifelong, what lifelong influences were these origins for you.
So Mum wasn't any English, she was Protestant. Well, she wasn't really Protestant. She's like most Church of England people are. That's to say, she'd been christened. And that was the last time she probably saw a church. But for all intents and purposes, she was Christian. The reason I mention that is my dad was Jewish. And I think back in those days especially, that was quite unusual. And Mum used to tell me when I was small, she said, "You're half Jewish." And I said, "Well, what half? What side of me is Jewish?" I didn't quite. And then I thought everyone was half Jewish, like you do when you're small. You think everyone speaks English, everyone lives in England, And gradually I realized that that wasn't the case, and that other people either had crosses. In those days, little girls had crosses around their neck, and Jewish people had what's called the Star of David, which I'm sure you're familiar with. And of course, I wanted to be the same as other people. So I had both around my neck, so if you can work that one out. So the Star of David and a cross going around. So that was the first kind of possible confusion I had with them. The other issue was that I learned my two grandmothers refused to speak to each other or be in the same room with each other, not because they had met and took a dislike to each other, sad though that would be, but because they were of different religions. Can you believe that? And the only saving grace there was that there was equal animosity on both sides. They both hated each other and were both equally prejudiced. So that was some small saving grace. But again, I think childhood influences such as they are and such as this was I learned really early on the absurdity of these kind of prejudices, or of prejudice generally, because my grannies didn't know each other, and yet they didn't like each other, and I couldn't work out why that was the case, given they were both very nice to me, and then the third influence that had is in those days, I didn't have in Australia the brownies. It's kind of the little girls before you become girl guides.
Yep.
So-called because they wore brown dresses in those days with little yellow tights, and all my friends were brownies, but Mum wouldn't let me be one because there were church parades, and in those days, brown shirt and marching was close to fascism, so she thought the brownies were fascists, so I wasn't allowed to join the brownies, even though everyone else was. So I felt, again, an outsider, not being a brownie and with my cross. So I think what I learned there was the absurdity of prejudice, and also very early on that you had to be yourself and fight your own corner and stand up for yourself and realize that you can't just be part of a tribe or a group and get away with it. You have to be an individual. And I think all my life, if there was a leitmotif, it's the power of the individual and the excitement of being an individual and respecting individuality in others. And once you realize that, life is so nice when you can have this world full of individuals, rather than people who are this or that. So I had no choice. I regretted it. You can't choose your parents, but they were amazing because although we were poor, Dad actually, his father was born in Austria. They came over as immigrants in the late part of the 19th century. Although they were poor, they were very loving, and that's the right kind of connection, which is when you realize in life you can't have everything you want. Because I wanted a pony, which was unlikely in Chiswick in those days. So I used to enter competitions to win a pony, and never won anything. And then much, much later, I was at this fancy in Texas lunch for ladies who lunch, and I was giving a talk and telling how I'd always wanted a pony, and this very well-meaning American matron came up after and said, "Do you still ride?" And I said, "Well, from time to time." "Oh, because we could give you a quarter horse," and the idea of trotting up to the BA desk, with a horse. So that would have been my dream when I was young, that someone gave me a pony, but obviously it never happened. But you learn in life, very early on, you can't have everything you want. So I went for riding lessons. I used to read about ponies and draw ponies, and got by that way rather than having my own.
I suspect those origins also had an influence on your work ethic, because I know, for example, I read you never take holidays.
Well, it's because I don't see it as work. Someone once said, "Do what you love, and you'll never have to work again." So I don't see work as work. I mean, it's what I do. It's like I play squash or go run or dancing or hanging out with mates. You know, it's part of my life. It's not work, you know, which is why this notion of a break, I always find that rather sad. I need a break, and a break from the weekend breaks and so. If you have to do that a lot, it should perhaps mean you should examine your real life and why you want to do that, you know, because
I understand.
I enjoy my life, and I'm not in the lab all the time. I'm doing these other things, but it's an integrated part of my daily life. So I don't really, and holidays are really, there's nothing more boring than having fun, actually. Having fun, yeah, when you're sort of determined to have fun, there's nothing more tedious, actually, than trying to have fun. Yeah, and fun comes naturally, but trying to contrive fun, you know, and right, I'm on the beach now and I'm going to have fun, you know, it's just, I find, well, for me, it doesn't work for me. You know, after you think, well, that was fun, oh, I enjoyed that, you know, but you can't contrive it or book it or pay for it, you know. And so I think you just have to live your life. And there'll be elements that you realize in retrospect were fun, you know, or you realize, I mean, coming here is a kind of holiday in a way, you know, because it's a different scene, it's a different environment, you meet different people. And that for me is much more refreshing than having fun sitting on a beach with an ice cream, you know. I don't think I'll take well to that.
It's got even worse these days. You have to take Instagram pictures while you're having fun.
While you're having fun, just so people see what fun you're having, yeah. And have you know people always have their mouth open? Yes, you know, so. You're having fun. Okay.
All right. So now let's think about your journey to neuroscience, because actually you didn't at all start out. You started out with classics,
yeah, I hated
right?
science at school. Yeah. So again, I went to a very smart school, which was unusual for someone of my socioeconomic background. But my mother had been there on a scholarship, and I followed in her footsteps. And so I had access to very privileged teaching and a whole range of subjects, and eventually. A very natural path to Oxford, so I can't claim working class heroine thing on that. Yeah, at that school, the way they taught science in those days, let's hope it's changed, was so dull. It was ticker tape trolleys, I don't know if you're looking at speed and time, and it was putting metal balls through rings to show that metal expanded, and then it was drawing very complex stenciled circuits of how to distill water. You know? And no one told me why distilling water was interesting, why you'd want to do that, you know, but it just had to be neat and dry. Meanwhile, in literature and history, it was all about why wars started, why people fell in love, what made the individual. Yeah. So it was no competition. It was obviously more interesting doing those things than doing the amoeba, you know, just splitting. You drew a circle, then you had to do a kind of egg timer, and then you drew two circles, and that was the amoeba reproducing. You know, I don't know if anyone else has been inflicted with that kind of stuff. Yeah. What was really interesting was I had a inspiration. I'm sure all of you have had a teacher, yeah, and had this particular mistress taught spot welding or something. I'd have done that, but she was called Veronica Lemon. She taught Greek, and so I was very excited about doing that. And up until that time, I'd winged it at school. So I was in the middle streams. I wasn't particularly distinguished because coming from the background I didn't realize about homework, yeah, and I had enough native wit to do it on the bus and but I so wanted to impress her, you know, that I realized if you prepared for your lessons, then you did well. And so in the exams, I got 90% or something the first. And so that set me up for doing Latin and Greek and ancient history, which is the perfect education because you're looking at literature and history combined. The literature is the history and the history is the literature. They're not artificially segregated. And moreover, you're comparing two very different civilizations with very two different ideas of empire. The languages, even the length of the syllables is different. The emphasis on the kind of things that preoccupied is different. So as always, if you compare things, it's a very enriching thing, compare and contrast. So having that advantage of being able to compare the Roman civilization with the Greek civilization and the languages compared. Not only that, it gives you a really very disciplined way of, I would say prefrontal cortex, of a working memory, because you have to bear in mind the very complex grammar where the ends of the words change according to the job they do in the sentences and the verbs change. So you have to remember these completely illogical rules, and that gives you a lot of discipline. And then you have to analyze very complex sentences that go on and have one main verb halfway down the page, you know? So all of that, I think, was very good, strong mental discipline, as well as being very enlightening about life in general and so on. So why would I want to do the amoeba? I mean, this was really exciting. And then on top of that, I have always enjoyed manipulating symbols, so I quite like maths. So I did pure maths as well, I just enjoyed getting a proof out, and it was just really satisfying in advance of just working through a proof. It was a bit like doing a crossword puzzle, you had a thing in the end. So, so I did classics, and if anyone had said at that time, you're going to ever be a biotech of a science company, I'd have thought the CEO of a science company.
So how then did you get from...
Yeah, so in those days you had to do an entrance exam for Oxford or Cambridge, and I offered classics, and I was offered a place in classics, but I wanted to do something called PPP, which is philosophy, psychology, and physiology. It was the 3P, of which you were supposed to choose 2. And given I didn't have any science, and I thought physiology was like physiotherapy. I didn't quite understand what physiology was anyway. So I did philosophy and psychology, a new subject. And philosophy was, in those days, much contrary to what I was expecting. In Oxford, it was 2 things. It was formal logic, which, if you've done maths, was just not a challenge. Yeah? And the other was linguistic. I remember sitting in the New Bodleian Library reading, get this, a chapter on the definite article. Yeah? And I thought, my limited time on this planet, do I really want to spend it agonizing about the word the? So after prelim, my tutor let me change to straight psychology, even though I'd done no science. Oxford being the kind of place that always said, okay, we'll go for it, you'll see. And so I did that and got more interested in the sort of physiology more than the actual behavioral options in my case. And then my tutor, again, who had a funny sense of humor, Jane Mellenby, who was a great mentor, sadly nowadays, she said, I think it'd be a laugh if you're a scientist. Go and see Professor Peyton in the pharmacology department. And I went in front of this very distinguished professor, and he said, so do you know what a millimolar solution is? That's a bit like saying, have you heard of Shakespeare? And I said, frankly, no, I haven't. And he said, never mind, you can tell us about Homer in the coffee breaks. And it was that kind of fun, actually. I know it sounds, in this very regulated world in which we live now, this might sound crazy, but I think I was talking earlier about this, I think giving someone the freedom, if they're enthusiastic and motivated, have a go. If you fail, you fail. You'll learn. You'll learn how enthusiastic you were, because you have to do, obviously, a lot more work than people who had traditional background. But, I was very grateful that I was given the chance. And it's a philosophy I've now applied to myself when people apply. I don't look at what boxes they tick. I just get a feel for how enthusiastic they are about what they want to do, even if they're not completely, ticking all the boxes up until now for things. Yeah.
I think that makes for a much richer experience for
everybody. It also
everybody.
makes, I think, for why I think I've challenged dogma in science, because I've never been afraid, because I was a newcomer to science, to ask very basic questions. Okay, so what is a millimolar? And because I didn't mind that, it means you do challenge. Well, why is it that there's a 10 to 20-year time lag in Alzheimer's? Why is it that only certain cells are vulnerable? Why is it there's a co-pathology with Parkinson's? And by doing that and taking no prisoners and being like a dog with a bone, sorry to mix metaphors, that actually, I think, helps you progress rather than being worried that people will think you should know something and you don't, and therefore you won't say anything. Yeah.
Okay, talking of, kind of prevailing orthodoxies, I'm curious, how did you become a life peer of the realm?
Okay.
How does one do that?
Well, sorry for anyone who's not a British citizen. No, forget it right now. I'm sure everyone's familiar with our political system, which are 2 houses, rather like I think you have here, the upper house, which is the revising chamber, and the junior chamber. In our case, that chamber is an unelected chamber, which in itself causes controversy and debate. Yeah, we'll leave that for another time. And it comprises different constituencies. So there's the Lords Spiritual, who are the senior bishops of the UK, it being a C of E country, and so we don't have rabbis, we don't have mullahs, unfortunately. There's a case that one should, but they're bishops, C of E bishops. And then you have the 3 main political parties. That's the Labour, which in our case, Labour is the left-wing party. We have the Tories, the Conservatives, and then we have the Liberal Democrats, who are sort of central. And then there's another group that are not political, called the crossbenchers. It sounds very strange. I'm going to use some strange words now. So crossbenchers sit in the middle because we don't have a party political affiliation, which means we're not whipped. Being whipped in parliamentary terms is you're told how to vote in debates. And this means, although we're a relatively small group of about 10% of the House of Lords, it means that we're lobbied hugely because we can vote as we wish. Yeah? Now, how that happened in my case was in 2002, the Blair government wanted to reform the House of Lords a bit, and very unfairly, you may be aware, up until then there was a large group of hereditary peers. I know this sounds astonishing in the 21st century, but people who were just born with a father who had a certain level of title, and they would just inherit it and have a right to make laws, which, if you think about it, is the Times did a big thing about this and how strange that must be nowadays. So they kicked out a lot of the hereditaries, leaving about 90 of them. They were forced to leave. They had an internal election, the hereditaries, to decide who would stay. And then they had this idea of people being appointed or nominated. And so I was nominated to apply. I had an interview. And the essential thing I want to stress is the first question they ask is, do you belong to a political party or not? And they really wanted people who were apolitical, which indeed I was.
Independent.
Independent, yeah. Not, and yet who had a level of expertise that would enrich debates. And indeed, debates in the House of Lords are much better than the kind of bear pit of the House of Commons, if you've seen that. Everyone's very polite to everyone. And we did one on stem cells a while back, for example, and everyone speaks to their expertise. So there was an economist, a medic, a philosopher on the ethics, me talking about the basic research. And if you read in Hansard that debate afterwards, that would be a really good way of informing yourself about every aspect of stem cells. You know? So the debates could be of a very high caliber simply because of the expertise. And it's not just us crossbenchers. There was also people that have had a lifetime in the diplomatic service, lifetime in politics, you know, who can bring a sort of wisdom that isn't necessarily there in the House of Commons. So I like to say that the House of Lords is a bit like the chairman to a CEO. The CEO is making all the decisions, yeah, and they're responsible, but they turn to advice and for help and discussion to the chairman. So it's a bit like that. So yeah, so I did this interview, and then that was in 2002. I was the first of the tranche to get in. Yeah.
And then my second question is, do you get to choose where you're Baroness of? Because
yes,
you're Baroness of Otmore.
Yeah, that's right, yeah. So you then go and see Garter Knight at Arms, right? And then he has this big atlas of England. And dukes are allowed a whole county, you know, like the Duke, yes, of Sussex. Yeah. But with the lowest form of nobility, you're allowed a sort of area. So someone else had Oxford, so I had Otmore, which is near, which I thought sounded medieval and quite romantic.
It sounds lovely, and it's a
wetland.
Nice, it's a wetland area, right?
Yeah, I have to tell my mum, though, with this. This is very funny. Because when I was phoned up and they said, would you accept this, you know, and so on, obviously I said yes. I said, well, it has to go to the Queen and the Prime Minister. She was then. So absolutely you must not say a word to anyone, and then it's going to be published in the paper. And I thought, well, if I tell my mum, how long will she be able to keep that as a secret? You know, it'd be about a microsecond. So I said to her, Mum, there's something really nice that's happened to me. It'll be in the papers at some stage. I don't know when. If it gets in the papers before I've had a chance to tell you, forgive me, but I absolutely can't tell you what it is. Mum said, oh, I can guess what it is. I can guess what it is. I said, what do you think? She said, you're pregnant.
I was going to say, I don't think she would guess.
Well, Mum, I don't think that meant, oh, you're not pregnant. Oh, so, I know what it is. You've won that Nobel Prize thing, haven't you? And I said, no, Mum, it's not that either. So, but notice the Nobel Prize was the secondary thing to being pregnant would have been the best thing of all. Nobel Prize, you know, kind of consolation, yeah. And when eventually I did tell her about the pitch, she didn't understand what it was, and so she had to use the Doris Greenfield sort of mark. So does that mean you'll be on the telly? That was, you know, the Doris Greenfield, you know, measure of the gold standard measure of success. But you see, this is why I'm saying my parents have been wonderful, because they are so grounded, and it actually is so good, rather than some snooty, snobby parents showing off. You know, well, does that mean you'll be on the telly then? Yeah,
well, I know you, I think it was back in February, you recently addressed the House of Lords pleading for more funding for dementia.
Yeah.
Has anything come of that?
Not as far as I know of, but then they wouldn't necessarily tell me directly. I was doing it on behalf of the Alzheimer's Society.
Yes.
And they helped with that. And it may be they've got further funds, but it's unlikely they're going to write to me and say it's because of this you did that. They've got enough time. No, I was happy to do that without, you know.
Yeah, I mean, a growing need, as we touched on this morning.
Sure.
Around the world.
Totally.
And the other thing I wanted to ask you about, and Professor Kiernan touched on this morning, is the multiplicity of awards that you've received.
Okay, let me tell you a story about awards, and I don't know if my great hero is someone called Richard Feynman, who you may have heard of, is a great physicist and so. And when he won the Nobel Prize, he said, well, okay, but I've already won the prize, I've done the science. That for me is the prize, not just this external, you know, if you're confident in yourself and you're doing what you do, why do you need to have that, you know, and show off about that. And so Feynman, who I'd recommend everyone to read, was a great human being. And he said, fine, yeah, but the whole point is the science, not that. So yes, I do have lots of garlands and blue ribbons, and I don't want to disparage them, but I think you have to put it into a context that they are what they are. It doesn't make you a better person, doesn't make you happier. Yeah, it might impress some people, I'm fine, yeah, but it is what it is, and you have it, that's fine.
I also remember seeing what I thought was a very funny speech you gave. I can't remember the context or where it was, but where I think you'd been listed as one of the most influential women in the world. Yeah. And you stood up and said, well, this is a great honor, except that I'm right next to Dolly Parton.
No, it was, no. Dolly Parton beat me. No, so
Dolly Parton beat you, there you go.
No, I was number 11 or something, yeah, and to Mum's great pleasure, the then Camilla Parker Bowles was number 14, so she was after me, that was great. But Dolly Parton was ahead, so that kind of puts it in context.
It does. So, obviously, we were just, talking about awards and successes, but I actually, in some ways, I'm a great believer in failure. Mm-hmm. So I tend to refer to, with my teams, to wins and learns rather than success or failure. But for today, let's talk about failure. Has failure been an element? Has that played any role in your life?
All the time, yeah. Someone said experience is what you get when you don't get what you want, And my American boss, someone called Rodolfo Linas, who I work with in New York, he said, if you're never wrong, you're not being stretched. And so another friend of mine did the sculptures on the Chardonnay and said, what is the point in doing easy things? So if you take all those quotes together, clearly you're going to fail, or you're going to have setbacks, or negative things are going to happen to you. And it's more how you turn that, the lemonade from lemons. And it does make you stronger, and I fear, and perhaps I'll touch on this tomorrow about screen generation, but I think everyone in life will have financial, medical, professional, emotional issues. Even Kate Middleton, poor bless her, has got cancer. Everyone will have issues. And the best thing you can do for people is to help them be resilient and to cope with them, not to try and protect them from them. And I think resilience is one of those most important things, and helping people cope with adversity rather than trying to shelter people from it. And that's something we'll perhaps discuss tomorrow, but I think it's really important. And having been born already not being able to have a pony, and before I was up there, so that I think was a great advantage, to doing that. So yes, I've had, lots of experiments that haven't worked, and as the scientists here will know, it's all the sweeter when it does work, when you finally see why it hasn't worked, and think, why was I so daft? And that, you can only learn from those things, and if you're right all the time, there's something wrong, I think.
Well, and even I often try to explain this to our donors. Science is about, you have a hypothesis, you pursue it, it may well turn out to be wrong, but even so, you've still added something to the science. Of course. Right?
And also the famous story of Fleming, of course, with penicillin, where a lesser person will say, it hasn't worked, I'm a failure, it hasn't grown, the bacteria. And of course, he said, well, there's a reason. So sometimes what might seem to be a failure or a bad thing actually turns out to be very insightful. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. I just also wanted to touch on, again, Professor Kiernan touched on it this morning. You've played a number of roles in Australia. We've talked about, Honorary Australian of the Year. Yeah. I think your first experience, though, was with Mike Rann in South Australia.
Before then.
Oh, before then?
Okay. So I won't do a hands up, because I'm sure no one put their hands up, perhaps with... there's a guy called Andrew Olley.
Yes,
who was a very famous broadcaster.
Well.
So that you can see certain heads are nodding here. Yep. And he was a very famous broadcaster who very sadly died early with a brain tumour. Yes. And his friends, Robin Williams among them, who I'm seeing on Thursday, clubbed together because they wanted a memorial lecture. So I came over, and my first time in Australia was to give the Andrew Olley Memorial Lecture.
I didn't know that.
Yeah. Well, there's no reason why you should. This is before you were born, Carole, obviously.
Indeed.
Obviously. So long time ago. And then in the audience was someone, the Meyer family, as in the Meyer stores, and they then asked me back to give I keep coming back to give memorial lectures for Kenneth Meyer, who was one of the Meyer family who'd been killed in a crash. And so I started to get traction in Australia. And then Mike Rann had this idea in 2004, because in those days, South Australia was considered the poor relation of the eastern seaboard states. I don't know if that's still the case, but it was considered...
I think not anymore.
No, but at that time, it was considered, And he had this revolutionary idea to import external people, so-called thinkers in residence, to try and innovate
Yeah.
and to bring, so this is an example of having a new idea when you've got a bad things happening that you wouldn't have if you were smug and if you were in Victoria or New South Wales, you don't need to do this, but they did, yeah?
Yeah.
And so I came for 3 months to Adelaide as Think in Residence 2004, and that was a great experience, and that's how I worked with him. And I'm still in touch with Mike Rann, who, if anyone wants to stay in Apulia, he now spends half the time in Apulia.
We were talking
in the winter,
about that
yeah,
before.
half
Yep.
the time back in Adelaide.
Yeah. So were you advising him on how to create the kind of science and innovation
Not
hub?
quite. It was even broader than that. It was think of things with all the stakeholders that might benefit or we could do. And the one that had the most traction, and it still exists, I'm very proud of it, is the Australian Science Media Centre, which I hope people have heard of. If you haven't, it's a two-way sort of agency for introducing the press to science that's not snake oil, that's been passed and is solid science for the press and media to report. And similarly for scientists to be able to, if they want a platform, to be able to, for example, the paper we've just done on Friday, it went out on Scimax thanks to the Australian Media Centre. It went to 1,000 journalists in Australia. So, and it's run by someone called Suzanne Elliott, who I actually appointed back in the, so she's still there, and she's amazing, she's the director. And someone called Peter Yates, who was from out of town and had been fired by Kerry Packer, so had a lot of press contacts. And what we did then was to raise money because it was rather delicate in that something as sensitive as the media, you have to escape the accusation that your sponsor is biasing what you're doing. So we toured all the different media people saying, look, this will be a service to you, you'll get decent science. And it stuck in my throat to say, I said, but you can't give us much, you can only give us a maximum of 5%. And by doing that, it meant we had multiple funding, so no one could claim they were able to influence
Yep.
it, yeah. And so Peter Yates is, he's based in Melbourne. That's why I come back a lot, because we've now, for the company, got lots of shareholders there. So yes, my story of Australia goes back, yeah.
Okay. You're also really, a gifted and prolific science communicator. And we were talking earlier today about how, you've written a number of books. You don't really have much time these days to do that.
Yeah.
But you've also written a dystopian novel.
Yeah, that was one of my lesser things, yeah. But at least it meant, because I'd written other books, at least they published it, even though it didn't get. But I enjoy it. On my bucket list was to write a novel. I don't think it's up there with, with all the rest. But it was, for me, an interesting thing to just you could do anything. You could make someone pregnant, you could kill someone, you could do anything you wanted. And that was a freedom that normally when you're writing scientific papers, you're not allowed, so much you might like to. No, it was about, so what it was 2121, set in the next century, and it was about the consequences of the screen technology. So there was these people called the others, and they just lived totally in a world driven by their senses and just in the moment. And inevitably there was an antithetical load of Puritans called the neo-pures, who were the opposite of that. And it was when they went to investigate the others. And then I won't do a plot spoiler, but I doubt I doubt if it's in print now. But anyway, it's called 2121.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Interestingly, I don't think he's here today. We've actually got one of our senior scientists, Professor George Paxanos, who does brain cartography.
Oh yes, I know the Atlas. Yeah.
But he has written a novel called A River Divided. It's a kind of environmentally based novel. But,
yeah. It's a luxury you can have, when you've already been, you're a step, but it's fun to do.
Do you think science communication has become increasingly absolutely an essential skill?
It always has
for all researchers.
Okay. Now I say this to my team. I say, you do all this work, but if you stand up, first of all, there's two ways of communicating. One is, of course, writing, and writing papers is a much more specialized art form, and that's, in a sense, more straightforward, and you're trained to do that. But if you want to persuade investors eventually, or if you want to outreach to schools, or to the wider public, or raise funds for donors, or just generally, actually, I would say also, even to specialists, you really have to speak in a very straightforward, non-jargon way, and people often hide behind jargon, And there was someone said, I forget, it may have been Freud or someone, or Einstein, that if you really understand something, you should make it understand in a way a 7-year-old should understand. And I think that is the challenge, to leave your ego of showing off what fancy long words you know. So, for example, instead of saying neuron, you say brain cell. Instead of saying transmitter, you say chemical messenger. So it's quite straightforward, but you have in your mind all the time, am I using a word that's going to turn someone off? And I know this personally because I was that person with Ian Chubb back in the day. You know, I was bamboozled very easily by these fancy polysyllabic words. And so you have to be very sensitive to that. And I think the other thing is to just be enthusiastic about what you're doing. Just speaking generally, I think there's nothing, I hate to say this, but that's why Boris Johnson and Trump, you know, were better than Rishi Sunak standing in the rain. You know, I don't know if anyone saw this, but it's having, you know, a huge energy can make a difference to how you engage with people.
I thought it was Rishi's slippers that did him in.
I don't know if you saw this, just to tell people, the announcement of the general election in the UK, traditionally held outside on a podium, outside number 10, Rishi Sunak decided he'd do it anyway, despite the fact the rain was pouring down, and no one thought to give him an umbrella, or some PR person thought not to have it, so he's just soaked to the skin. Yeah, just check it out, it's a very miserable affair, yeah.
So let's turn our thoughts now a bit to leadership in science. I wondered, I mean, we've talked about, in fact, some not so fortunate experiences that you've had, but is there a pivotal moment that you've experienced in terms of leadership in science that then shaped your leadership?
Well, there's certain people that have. I haven't necessarily met them. My favorite one is Rita Levi-Montalcini. I don't know if people have heard of her. So she was born in Italy in about 1902 or 3, something like that, and she was Jewish. So you can work out by the time she grew up the situation that was facing her. And she was a medical doctor, but because of the Mussolini regime, she was forbidden from practicing medicine. So what she did, resilient, she set up a lab in her own house, and the initial work she did there eventually won her the Nobel Prize. And on top of that, if you see pictures of her, even into her, she lived to be over 100. She was really elegant and beautiful with her hair up. And so she, for me, was the ultimate sort of model, role model. Not that I ever met her, of course, but you know, she's certainly, I would check her out, anyone that wants to see the power of the human spirit and so on. Yeah.
And do you have words to describe your own leadership style
in
terms of
very
your
much.
teams?
Yeah. This is something I'll coin because it's in common, which is the servant leader.
Yes.
So you're familiar.
I'm familiar
perhaps
with
people
it.
are familiar with the servant leader. So
they may not be familiar.
okay, so the
please.
notion of the servant leader, which is absolutely not mine at all, I can't remember who did it, is the idea that you always put the people that you are responsible for them, and you put them first, not yourself. Yeah, so if you're in the trenches, you go over first, yeah? You don't expect the others to go over. But also, your main priority is, are they comfortable, happy, you know, secure, supported? And if you do that, you'll find everything else follows in terms of the loyalty to you, the respect for you, the hard work for you, yeah? So I've tried to do that all the time, which is, instead of self-aggrandizing yourself, which men tend to do particularly more, we'll come to that at some stage, you know, is actually thinking about the people you're responsible for and how they can be the most fulfilled and deliver as best they can. So, but the servant leader, check it out, it's a very good concept. But I was trying to do that anyway before I knew the name of it, yeah. But,
yes,
yeah.
I'm an advocate of that as well. Okay, I'm going to pause there for a moment because we're going to run out of time and just give everybody else an opportunity to perhaps ask you some questions. We've got our roving mics, so just, I can't see you very well because of the lights.
No, the lights are,
pop your hand up and one of the guys will bring the mic to you.
Thank you. Susan, you've touched on this earlier about science communication. As a fantastic researcher and also an even more fantastic science communicator, how do you deal with the challenges that we have seen, particularly post-pandemic, but more recently around the general mistrust in science? I've Googled it myself. I've done my own research on the internet, and I know this, that, and the other.
Sounds like my cousin. She's done that.
And fake news. How do we continue to conduct research, ask governments and taxpayers to fund research, and communicate about research in that kind of environment?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think more generally anyway, we question now what is the truth in a way that we didn't 20 years ago. You know? What do we mean by the truth? Because in any event, the science truth is provisional. It's only, you know, at the mercy of the next experiment or the next set of data. But it's a fair point. And this is why the Science Media Centre, for example, is even more important than it was 20 years ago. Because you need to have some kind of body that can actually filter for you and scrutinize for you. And I think that she's doing, Susanna, we have the same in England, and I think now it's gone around the world, Science Media Centres. But I think having that is a really important thing. And we were talking earlier about science probity, and I gather now Simon
Gandiv,
who might, I don't know if he's here, but was saying how you need to have a certain strict checklist, that you are very accurate in your science papers, and actually, even though it's seductive that if you get the paper published, you'll get more research, the most important thing is to be true. There's nothing more important than the truth. Yeah, and eventually it gets seen through that. Do you remember that thing with amyloid and Western blots about when someone was disclosed that they'd fudged the results? And it's not worth it. And in any event, what's the point of doing something if you're lying or cheating and so on? And I think that certainly among professional scientists, you need that kind of checklist to really make sure that you haven't taken out the outlier, that you haven't changed the p-value, that you've actually been really strict with yourself. In terms of the general public, actually having talks like this in the Science Media Centre, I think, and not just believing everything you read on the internet, but that is an increasing problem in life anyway now.
Other questions? Oops.
There's one up there. No, there's up there. Yes.
Sorry. Thanks. I had a follow-up question to that. Given what's happening now with open access publishing, which, was a great idea, but it does mean that there's no filter left anymore, because the university libraries used to be the filter. They would say, your journal's rubbish, I'm not going to subscribe to it. And now there is no filter. So there's an awful lot of stuff being published which perhaps shouldn't be published and is undermining, in a way, confidence in science. Do you have any
it's a hard
views
one.
on that?
Yeah, I think it's much more important now for the individual scientists to have strict criteria and a strict critical faculty in a way perhaps they wouldn't have before, to make sure they're looking at the controls carefully. And so I'm doing this because I can't really see. But to apply their own kind of checklist, Yeah, no, sorry. Yes, it was. Again, it sounds a good idea because open access, rather than having to pay for things, has to be good. But as always, then it could be, I agree, you could be letting in things that really shouldn't be there, that are misleading or inaccurate and so on. It also means a lot more delving and detecting for the individual scientist. So I think it's tougher on the individual scientist, really, because it's not ready-made for you. You have to be your own critic. Yeah. And so what we can do with our younger people is train them to be absolutely ruthlessly critical and tough at what they're reading.
Matthew, you had one.
So fingers crossed you cure Alzheimer's disease and the royalties are coming in and you've got hundreds of billions of pounds. What would you invest in?
Oh, good question. Other than buying the chateau in France and the pony, I'll buy myself a pony eventually.
Finally.
No, seriously not. It's a really, I think if I had a lot of money, my own money, I'd like to set up a trust for people such as I was who are left of field, who are having the strange ideas, the ones that aren't going to find favour with the research councils and the peer-reviewed people because you haven't done it already, or because it's such an outlandish, challenging idea it can't possibly be true. I would like to give them some kind of space or opportunity. I think if I was very rich, that's what I'd like to promote. I'd also like to promote for both genders, but especially for women, training and help in becoming resilient, standing up to criticism, being critical yourself, because I think at the moment there are issues there. Yeah.
So interesting, you'd use it to create space for creativity,
Oh,
essentially.
totally, as well as the pony, yes. But
Yeah. Okay. Any more questions out there?
You can always email if you want to ask anything more personal and you don't want to fess up in front of however many people. Yeah. You can always email.
I had a couple left. So we haven't really touched on this, although it's been mentioned, your work on the impact of digital technologies on young minds. Do you want to give us a bit of an insight?
So this was one of the advantages of being in the House of Lords, actually, in that there, the etiquette when you have a debate is you speak to your knowledge base, yeah? And there was one in 2009, I think it was, that came up on pornography sites for children and regulating that. And I'm not a lawyer, but I thought the angle I could take, you always think, what angle can I take that's my expertise? I thought, well, I'll do the neuroscience angle, which is the brain adapts to the environment. If the environment is changing, becoming two-dimensional with only two senses, then obviously the way people think and feel will change accordingly. And whether it's good or bad is another question, but it will definitely change. And I said this, pretty straightforward. No neuroscientist would challenge that or dispute that. I did it in my little fight. You have 5 minutes in the House about, and you have to read your speech because, the newspaper's there and so on. And so we may ask, what is them? So it's like that. Really, anyway, so I stood up and had my slot and I read it, thought no more of it. But you think I'd said the world was caving in. As Baroness says, computers rot the brain. It was all over the tabloids, and someone called Drudge or Dredge in America. It went on that, and then I was on the radio there. I was on the Week in Westminster, and it became a huge thing. Not all of it flattering. I was called an alarmist and sort of Amish. They thought I was the Amish. Anti, fuddy-duddy.
Luddite.
Luddites, all the rest.
Yeah.
So that's what I'm saying. You have to be tough, and if you stand up for your beliefs, you have to. So no, I had a really tough time. A lot of it. I mean, obviously some people agree, but some didn't. And then it made me read and think and write more. And you'll hear more about that tomorrow. I'll present it. But I wrote the book Mind Change because I said it was like climate change, and it was controversial. It was worldwide, and it was multifaceted. So if you're talking about screen technologies, you can break it down into video games or search engines, or social network. So they're different things that might present with different problems. So you can't just say the screen and so on. So eventually, as a consequence of the House of Lords and a huge amount of attention that got more than anything, I wrote the book Mind Change in 2014. So that was my brick in the wall, and that's 10 years on now, and had I had more time, if I wasn't running the company and trying to get a better treatment for Alzheimer's, someone said, why don't I do a 10-year update? But there's so much work on it now, and some people are doing full-time work on this, that I don't have the bandwidth or indeed the expertise to do that, but it's the one time in life I'm sorry I was proved right, because now the dial has shifted, and everyone is now wringing their hands and saying what issues they are, certainly in the UK, I'm sure here. And at the time, being called an alarmist, there is a kind of element that says, well, I told you so, but I don't feel that at all. I just feel, what a shame.
I think it's something a lot of parents have worried about instinctively,
Well, how could they not? If the kid screams, if you take this part away, and they're doing nothing else, how that would be a worry, I suspect,
Yeah. And I mean, I notice it, the impacts even amongst adults, the inability to kind of do one thing at one time as opposed to multitasking.
Well, what I find the saddest, and same here, if I take the train from Oxford to London quite a lot, everyone is on their phone. No one is looking out the window, or reflecting, or everyone is just down on their phone, and I just find that really sad. Yeah. What would the ancient Greeks have thought if they've come back now to see how humanity, this pinnacle of civilization, all of us are sort of like this,
Yeah, no,
so not communicating.
I notice it even, when I go to the gym and I put the phone in the locker because that's my time for me, and everybody else is on their phone and trying to do their exercise at the same time.
But also, no, I think that we haven't seen the full, this is the biggest uncontrolled experiment in the human mind ever, because most of us were born in the last century. Well, perhaps not, actually, I say that now, but and therefore, we had the privilege of living in 3 dimensions and having stimulation from 5 senses and having a box that became the spaceship and all this sort of thing. Whereas if you are born in this century and you've had nothing but social media, you're uncomfortable, therefore, possibly in facing what kind of relationships you're going to have, what kind of marriages you're going to have, what kind of parents you're going to be, what kind of work colleagues you're going to be, if you haven't rehearsed living in the real world, So I'll touch on it tomorrow. I don't want to say too much now, but it's a spoiler to come tomorrow night. It's to tempt people to come tomorrow evening. Yeah.
So last question from me, and probably from all of us, because I know we have to jump in a car at 5 o'clock. This is a question I often get asked, and I'm never sure I have given the right answer, so I'll be interested in yours.
There's no right or wrong answer, I'm sure.
Well, the question, it often comes from donors or board members, members of the public, is, there's been such a focus over many years in terms of charitable giving on cancer research, right? And the question is really, do you think that the time of neuroscience has come or has not yet come and is still to come? And if it is still to come, what can we do to make people focus and realize neuroscience is the next frontier?
Sure. Well, I think it depends. When you're talking about cancer, that's talking about a disease. Neuroscience is a whole area.
Is a domain.
Is a domain. Now, if you want to talk about disorders of the brain and neuroscience, obviously Alzheimer's, up until now, as everyone knows, it's been embarrassing to talk about or not wanting to talk about. Mum said that in the older, she used to refer to, oh, she's got the C word, and the C word was cancer, because they feared that even if you said the word, you would give yourself cancer, yeah? That's how it was. So I think it's similar, that if you talk about it, suddenly you're going to get it. And I think that's hopefully thanks to notable people like Terry Pratchett, who had it and talked about it, and I think now that is, I hope, changing. But marketing neuroscience, as opposed to a disease, is to get people excited about the brain. I know that sounds silly, but they take it for granted. But as I'll touch on tomorrow, and I think this is an element to say, is you are your brain, and your brain adapts to the environment, and therefore it's in our control what kind of minds people have in the future. And it's not as if you're just born with a certain personality. These things evolve and they interact with the environment and so it's so exciting that, unlike other parts of the body, this is something that we prize. Our identity is more important than anything else, who we are. And as I say tomorrow, there's no one ever been like you for the 100,000 years we've been on the planet, nor will there ever be again. And your identical twin, your clone, isn't like you. And that's always a good line, you know, to say. Therefore, given we prize our uniqueness and our mind so much, hence we fear Alzheimer's, surely that is worth exploring and understanding and optimizing for the benefit of yourself and society. Yeah.
But also, I think that, you know, discrepancy we were talking about earlier between the health span and the lifespan.
Yeah.
And I was interested that you said to me there's a 10-year discrepancy.
Yeah, typically, very sadly, we talk about lifespans, but there's also health span. And really, in an ideal world, they should co-terminate, but they don't. Typically, there's a 10 years when health span ends before lifespan ends. My own mother is going through that now, so I can speak firsthand what that's like. And really, the challenge is to make them co-terminate so that everyone has a fulfilling, independent, healthy life, and then you die, rather than 10 years of misery and indignity and dependence on other people. Yeah.
And see, then how I connect that to neuroscience is that I think the brain is going to be the key determinant of whether they do keep living a healthy, independent life.
Sure, yeah, because as I think someone said, you know, they don't mind not being able to run a marathon as long as they've got their mind. Yeah.
Correct. So that's our job.
Yeah, exactly. Okay.
And we're very glad to have you with us for these
it's
couple
great
of
being
days.
here. I've enjoyed today. Thank you very much.
And to help us do our jobs even better.
And
Thank
if,
you.
let me reiterate, if you want to email me, Carole has my email. You might want some personal question, which I'm happy to do.
Thank you very much, Susan.
My pleasure. Thank you.